So what I'm going to be talking about today is learning from Rotherham, the lessons learned in terms of national CSE practice, the implication for you, but also where in terms of practice we need to be looking going forward. Before I start, I would just like to make a general introduction to myself. I am a former solicitor. Some of you may already know my background, which I'll explain in a moment. And at the moment, I am an independent safeguarding children trainer and consultant, and I work across the UK with a range of safeguarding issues, including child sexual exploitation. I'm also the author of a book that was published last year, CSE After Rotherham, which examines practice across all agencies in relation to child sexual exploitation. From 2000 to 2002, I took what was supposed to be a secondment from legal practice to be the Research and Development Officer leading a Home Office funded pilot in Rotherham. And it was that work really that I think defined both my safeguarding practice, but certainly led on to me developing the expertise that I've got in child sexual exploitation. And it's that work I'm going to start off talking to you about today. And I think it's fair to say that since 2011, when news of Rotherham first broke, I've been involved in a number of different investigations and inquiry into Rotherham, but I've also contributed to other national initiatives, for example, the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse. So I just wanted to start by recapping over what happened in Rotherham, because it's a dialogue, it's a story that people have discussed many times across the country, but I don't think it hurts to go back to the actual facts of what happened and just refresh our memory. And I think the key part for me is that when I arrived in Rotherham to lead on the Home Office pilot, what I found almost instantly was a long-standing denial and failure to respond to concerns around CSE in the town. And there were a significant number of young people that had been identified as being at risk or being involved in CSE. There were also some identifiable abusers, and they had been identified by a number of services across the town from 2000 onwards. So what I mean by that is a small group of mainly men, some women, had been identified by services including a specialist project that I was based with, which was a youth service project working with young women involved in child sexual exploitation, but also social workers, police officers, health practitioners, education, and the voluntary sector. They were all giving me information about a very identifiable group of men who were abusing young women in the town. And what I found was the response to that information was one of denial. So what I also found was information from 1999 suggesting that actually there were a large group of young girls, some as young as 12, being targeted and abused in the town. Now I say young girls because we were also finding evidence of young boys, but the project that I was based with and my remit was to look at young girls only. And that information was shared with the police from 1999 onwards, by myself from 2000 onwards, and it just didn't just involve child sexual exploitation. It involved grooming offences, it involved violent crimes, it involved suggestions of drugs trafficking, of getting young people involved in substance misuse, and also human trafficking. So very serious offences that these young children were being exposed to. And I think what astounds me, and it continues to astound me to this day, was that the energies of the statutory powers in Rotherham on the main, their energies were put into responding to the behaviour of the young people. And what that meant was a denial of the offending behaviour. So quite often myself or colleagues from the Risky Business Project would go to meetings, would share the information that we were finding, and what we would be told was that the information was hysterical, or that it was exaggerated, or it was from a source that wasn't credible, wasn't professional. And it really didn't matter how much that information was cross-referenced or corroborated, there was still that denial to it. And instead what people focused on was young people going missing from home, being a waste of police resources, being very difficult to deal with, being very aggressive, without actually looking at the abuse that they were experiencing night after night. So children and their families were very much treated as their problem, and I say that because I don't think there was a single family where the parents were engaged as protective factors, quite the opposite. And what that added up to was a wholesale practice failure by the police, social care, education, health, youth justice, you name it. The only service that actually didn't let young people down was the voluntary sector, the third sector. But even worse than that, I think, what defines Rotherham was that there was a conspiracy of silence. And what I mean by that was anybody who did come forward, and I wasn't the only person, who was trying to make what I was finding known to senior managers, senior police officers, agencies outside of Rotherham. Anybody who was trying to make that known were quite heavily suppressed. And some of you may be familiar with my story, that in my particular case that involved me being suspended for work for gross misconduct, for sharing information outside of Rotherham, and also being threatened by a number of police officers. And I wasn't alone in that, sadly. But the reality is what was being ignored, and I think this is the shocking part, because what was being ignored was this. So we had children as young as 12 being abused, and the levels of sadism and torture that those children were subjected to is indescribable. So children having petrol poured on them and being told that they were going to be set alight. Children being forced to witness the rape and torture of other children. Children suffering life-changing injuries. Children experiencing threats to their family, to their younger siblings, to people that they loved and cared about. Children being raped by multiple perpetrators night after night after night, and feeling that there was no way out for them. And certainly as time went on, threats to silence those children, which to them represented very, very real threats. Threats that were interpreted by those children as threats to kill. And what that added up to was a number of things, really. But there was certainly, I think, a long time where vulnerable children who were being groomed were identified and allowed then to move into a position of being abused by these perpetrators. And I think for me that was the most difficult thing, that I was identifying a number of young people with where the right intervention, their abuse could have been halted or could have been prevented. And what I was forced to witness instead was those young people moving from being at risk to being abused. And it's no exaggeration, that is something that will haunt me to my dying day. What we also saw as well in Rotherham was abusers feeling invincible, feeling that there was nothing to stop them, that actually they were untouchable, that they could pretty much do what they liked with the children in that town and beyond, and nobody was going to hold them accountable. And I don't need to tell you, therefore, that made child sexual exploitation a very attractive proposition for those perpetrators indeed. So, unsurprisingly, the problem grew, and I'll come back to that. So, this continued on. I left my employment in 2002, and I genuinely believed that I had been able to share my findings with sufficient people that it would make a difference. Unfortunately, that wasn't to be the case, and it wasn't until Andrew Norfolk started writing about Rotherham in the Times newspaper that the full horror really became known. And of course what followed that was the commissioning of the Jay report. Alexis Jay commissioned to do an independent inquiry into Rotherham, published in 2014, and she identified an astonishing 1,400 victims in an 8-year period. Can I tell you, there were nowhere near that amount of victims when I was working in Rotherham. And that figure, I think, astonished us all, to see it laid bare like that, just how many young people had been abused. And then, of course, what happened was, following the Jay report, Louise Casey was brought in by the Secretary of State to do a further report into Rotherham, and her report suggested that the figure could be even higher. And in the last few weeks, we've had a National Crime Agency report, which has also suggested that the figure is actually higher than Alexis J thought. And I think this is the astonishing thing. So this is now coming from the J report. This isn't just coming from my perspective. That professional responses on the whole didn't recognise, didn't accept information about abuse, about warning signs of abuse. And can I tell you, some of that information included CCTV footage of young people being removed with force from residential homes by known abusers. The professional responses didn't follow any practice guidance on policies. And can I just be clear, Rotherham had really good policies and procedures. That wasn't the issue. The issue was that nobody followed them. And certainly in terms of the behaviour of young people, what we were seeing and what we were trying to communicate to statutory services were signs of trauma. The kinds of behaviour that you would expect any young person to exhibit had they been raped and abused repeatedly. And instead, actually, how that behaviour was interpreted was that those young people were deviant, that they were out of control, that they were naughty children, that they weren't innocent victims, that they were somehow deserving of the abuse that they were experiencing. And I went to countless meetings where I heard young people being referred to as a waste of police resources, discussions around secure accommodation, nobody actually discussing their mental health and their well-being, nobody discussing how to prevent further rape, nobody discussing a response to the people who were raping them. It's quite unbelievable, isn't it? And also, what we didn't see was a differentiation between that behaviour and what might be considered normal adolescent behaviour. So we'd go to meetings and again hear stories of, yes, but they're just a teenager, all teenagers go through this stage, and nobody actually stopping to think what the behaviour might be telling them. And as I've already said, we you know, in Rotherham, one of my biggest frustrations was that nobody was looking at the issue of boys and young men, and they were very clearly being abused as well. I've already said parents and carers weren't engaged as protective factors. In actual fact, a number of parents were arrested, and I think a couple of fathers actually charged with criminal offences which related to them trying to extract their daughters from a house where they were being raped. And while the father was being arrested, and in one particular case the daughter was also arrested, the adult men in the house and the other young people who were there being abused were left by the police. And certainly a number of professional sources of information dismissed, ignored, told it wasn't helpful. I certainly submitted a mapping exercise and a document which pulled together all of the information that I'd been able to find out in the first year of the pilot, and I handed that in to the police, and what I was told was, and this is a direct quote, it was unhelpful because it was unsubstantiated information. And I remember thinking at the time, but isn't that the job of the police to go and investigate sources of potential intelligence that's been given to them? So what it all adds up to really was a number of opportunities that were missed in Rotherham. It wasn't just one opportunity, it was a number. And also, what we heard repeatedly from the police that was that they needed complaints from victims. It wasn't enough for us to give disclosures that had been passed on to us or to say that what we'd been told, they needed direct complaints. And ironically, when we did find a very small number of young people who were willing to do that, they were told they were not credible witnesses. Mainly because by that stage they were engaged in substance misuse as a coping strategy. They'd maybe been arrested by the police for being drunk and disorderly or violent conduct, or they had been brought back from the police from being missing from home. So they were regarded as not credible sources of information. In other words, they didn't present as an innocent enough victim. And I think the worst for me is that some of those children were charged with criminal offences, but certainly all of the children that I'm talking about were condemned to more abuse when that could have been prevented. So you have to ask, don't you, why the denial? You know, if all of that information was coming in, and I mean, bear in mind I was there as an independent person. I was there representing essentially a Home Office pilot. solicitor by occupation, so very much working on evidence-based practice. You have to ask why the denial. And that's a really difficult question, and I'm not sure really we understand completely the answer to it. But what has been suggested by a number of sources, and what I also believe, is that the abuse was something that we had never seen before. And it was so horrific and so sadistic that some practitioners just could not accept that it was happening in their town. And particularly, Rotherham is a very small town. It's not a huge, sprawling metropolitan town. I think, therefore, the scale of it, even when I was there, seemed unbelievable. And, of course, the response that was going to be needed wasn't going to be a quick fix. So what we were going to need was targeted long-term resources. It was going to be costly, in other words. I've already touched on the point that a lot of the victims were seen as not being innocent, and I went to a number of meetings where the behaviour of young people was discussed. An example, one young person who was 12 who was pregnant, and a police representative at a review of her child protection plan objected to the fact that we were talking about child sexual abuse. And in his words, this child was happy to have sex with these men. So there was a complete lack of understanding of the grooming process and what was happening to those young people. And very, very much a problem of a perception of problem families. It was the families that was to blame. And ironically, when the Alexis J report came out, one of the newspaper headlines reflected the views of a fairly senior manager in children's social care who talked about how the families needed to accept some degree of responsibility. Can I tell you, the families and carers that I worked with were absolutely desperate for help and weren't getting it. There was also a heavy involvement from males of a Pakistani heritage. Rotherham in the past had had real race relations issues and had put a lot of dedication, thought into trying to resolve that. So the fact that these perpetrators looked to be predominantly from that background made a lot of senior officials very nervous. And I think there was just a complete lack of understanding of what was going on. Later, of course, what's come out is some allegations of possible corruption involving some officials both in the police and the council, and that's currently under investigation. So what were the consequences of the failure to act? Well, quite simply, the problem grew, and it grew exponentially. You would expect that because it was a low-risk, high-reward activity without consequence. As I've said, the abusers felt invincible, so invincible, in fact, that one of them, in 2012, gave an interview to national TV, and the focus of that interview, or certainly the point that he wanted to get across, was that he and his brothers had been accused of a crime that they didn't commit, and actually they were the victims. As I've said, children who were identified at risk were left to be further abused, and the overall consequence is that there were huge long-term issues for children, their families, and indeed the community as a whole. And I just wanted to share with you this quote from one young woman, just to give an example of the kind of long-term issues that we're talking about. So in terms of the cost to victims, because I think this is really what we need to focus on, I've already talked about a worry that any kind of response would be costly and long-term. Well, actually, what we know is that the long-term consequences for those victims are far more than that. So we've got health consequences, including very severe long-term mental health issues, including some diagnoses of post-traumatic stress syndrome. Some of the victims, as I've already said, received criminal offences. Some of that was because their abusers were encouraging them to commit criminal offences so that they became identified by the police as the problem rather than a victim of crime. Unsurprisingly, a number of victims developed substance misuse issues as a coping strategy. Also, what we saw was loss of opportunities in education and employment. It won't, I think, come as any surprise to you to know that a number of the young people that we're talking about didn't leave school with qualifications. How can you go back into a schoolroom when you're being raped every night? How can you focus on studying for exams on your future when your future's been raped every night. So what that means is that those young women were deprived of their future, of the potential that they had. And of course the impact on the family, a significant numbers of families were ripped apart by what was happening to the daughters. The children themselves, when they grew older, became involved in child protection systems with their own children. So what I mean by that was when they became pregnant, there was automatically a pre-birth assessment of whether they were a risk to their own children. A risk because they'd been abused as children themselves. And I remember vividly one young girl who was 15 going to a pre-birth conference. It looked as if her baby was going to be removed at birth. She was given the same social worker for her baby as she had herself, and the social worker was not interested in her, they were only interested in the baby. I said, well, what about this child here? She's 15 years old. Where's the support for her? What about the risk to her? And what came out of that was a familiar story. A young woman where all the responsibility for avoiding the abuse, for dealing with the abuser, was placed on her shoulders. And I wanted to share with you this quote from a woman who participated in the Drew Review of South Yorkshire Police 2016. And what she said really resonated with me, because it was a double whammy really, that professional response, because the grooming process tells you that you're worthless, that you have no value to anybody, but actually professional responses can really re-emphasise that. And certainly the consequences for a lot of the victims in Rotherham was that they felt that nobody could help them, that they just had to suffer the abuse until eventually it went away. And as I say, we're talking about very young children in some cases here, but no child deserves that experience or that professional response. I'm going to touch very briefly on the financial consequences, because this is where it moves really from an individual consequence to a society-wide consequence. And I think it puts into context that while preventative work may be resource heavy and may be expensive, it's money well spent in the long run. Because the consequences for Rotherham, if you look at the cost of mental health services alone, some of the victims who came forward and spoke to Alexis J have still not received the therapy and the mental health services that they need because of the length of the waiting lists involved. Obviously, general health consequences and the cost to the health service, but a significant number of victims in receipt of benefits, having contact with social care, having contact with the police, living in local authority housing, moving from area to area, there's a cost attached to that. There's also the loss of income and investment, as I've already talked about, because the potential of those young people were lost. It won't surprise you to know that there was an increase in crime in Rotherham associated with the CSE and the perpetrators. In more recent times, what we've seen is a claim against a local authority and the police by some of the victims. And also, I think what we've got to take into account is the cost of the investigations into historical abuse. They're huge. They run into hundreds of thousands of pounds. And of course the cost to the reputation of the town in terms of businesses wanting to be there, investment and community relations. So getting it right, why it matters. I want to just touch on this quote from Alexis J, because to me it really sums up the misery that followed on from being a victim of child sexual abuse. So just to put that into context, a number of young people left unsupported, their abusers weren't responded to, and eventually the abuse ended. It may be ended because they left the area, because they got to an age where they weren't attractive to perpetrators anymore, but actually the abuse didn't end there, because what followed was years of being a vulnerable adult, of being being a victim of domestic abuse, of post-traumatic stress, mental health, etc. So, you know, the young people who did manage to extract themselves from CSE didn't go on to have fruitful and productive adult lives. So I wanted to start looking at the implications for practice, and what I wanted to talk about was the road from Rotherham, because as horrific as Rotherham is, there have been a huge number of positives that have come out of Rotherham. And one of them is 30th of March 2015, David Cameron declared CSE a national threat. I was at the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse earlier this week. We're still talking about it being a national threat, and that's absolutely right, because let's not kid ourselves, it's happening in every community in this country. And far from it being a problem that's receding or going away, all the evidence suggests that actually it is still a very real threat to our young people. And the internet and the increase in online abuse, of course, has to be taken into account. But the reality is that the fact that it was declared a national threat meant that it was a priority for local authorities and, more importantly, for police forces. And a number of local authorities and police forces consequently have conducted audits, scrutinised their own practice, started to look at how they respond to child sexual exploitation and question whether or not their responses have been good enough. We've also seen a significant number of victims speaking out across the UK and gaining strength from being able to talk about their experiences, recognising that it may help others, but also the validation that they were a victim, that it wasn't their fault. So it's been the start of their recovery. We've also had a National Crime Agency investigation into Rotherham. That's continuing to this day. And of course, following it being declared a national policing priority, we've had a considerable number of police investigations and prosecutions. And you may be familiar, there's been some very recent large-scale prosecutions, for example, in Newcastle more recently. So the abusers that have enjoyed, shall we say, immunity from prosecution for so long are finally being brought to account. And what we're seeing as time goes on is more and more current cases, not just historical cases. And we're also seeing an increase in the work of specialist services, such as some of the charities who specialise in working with child sexual exploitation. CSE is now referenced in the Ofsted inspection framework. So what that means is that schools have a responsibility to make sure that staff are trained and adequately skilled to respond to the issue, but also that there should be awareness raising with pupils, with students, not just around child sexual exploitation, around healthy relationships, around grooming, around online abuse. We've also started to see an involvement of local businesses and the public, so giving those people who are our eyes and ears, particularly out of hours, particularly late at night, the skills, the ability to share information with us around child sexual exploitation. And the number of pilots that have run have been extremely successful and have resulted in some prosecutions, certainly identification of abusers that were previously unknown to the police. And we're also starting to see a huge sea change, I think, in how the press report this issue. You know, we're not hearing about child prostitutes or sex gangs anymore. What we're hearing about is child sex abusers and victims of child sexual abuse, and child sexual abuse being given the sensitivity that it deserves in the press. And some areas, Leeds for example, have started running local vulnerability audits, and what that means is they're starting to try and identify patterns. So is it a particular local authority area where children are overrepresented in terms of being victims of CSE? Are there particular schools, for example, where there's overrepresentation? Are the abusers coming from a particular area? And what they're trying to do is identify the problem and nip it in the bud before the abuse happens. In other words, they're not just waiting for somebody to come in and make a complaint of a crime. I've already spoken about the independent inquiry into child sexual abuse, which is trying to help us understand the issue of child sexual abuse generally. And the Children's Commissioner has also been doing a lot of work in England, including introducing an initiative called the Barnahus, which unfortunately I don't have time to talk to you about today, but is an alternative to the criminal justice system when a child is a victim of child sexual abuse, and in essence means that a child is never directly cross-examined by a defence barrister and never has to go through the trauma of going to court to give evidence, or indeed having to wait months and in some cases years for the case to get to court. So all really important things that are changing the landscape of professional responses to CSE. So I wanted really to start pulling together the lessons for you in moving forward in future practice. So I wanted to look at, first of all, preventative work. It goes without saying, doesn't it, that actually when we look at preventative work, I can't overemphasise the importance of it, because it is exactly what it says on the tin. It will prevent some, not all, we've got to be realistic, but it will prevent some abuse. So that early identification is absolutely essential. How many of us want to wait until we see the signs of abuse in a child, or we receive a complaint of a crime? And the starting point to that, I think, as a nation, is our growing awareness of early childhood adversity, or ACE, as it's known. So the children that we know are more vulnerable to being abused and groomed, for example. But also being able to give children the knowledge, the skills to recognise risky behaviour. Now, that's not to suggest that we're placing the responsibility for avoiding abuse on young people's shoulders. It's part of an overall response of trying to narrow down the opportunities that abusers have. And that, incidentally, also includes giving that knowledge to parents and carers. So that involves very careful and appropriate use of resources. Now, I know there's been a lot of controversy around CSE resources, and I know that there is some research that suggests that showing young people CSE resources can cause trauma. I think it's down to the skill of the person who uses the resource. But I would absolutely agree we shouldn't be showing children videoed images of rape. But absolutely essential that we do consider carefully how to raise young people's awareness. And also, as I've said, not just around CSE, but online safety, healthy relationships, what's sexually appropriate behaviour, respect, all of those issues really that enable young people both to understand what they should be bringing in terms of a relationship, but also what to expect. And I think that's particularly important when we consider the rise of peer on peer abuse. Safer recruitment, better safeguarding cultures, practices. Obviously there's been a great deal of controversy around some charities recently. It's about narrowing the opportunities that we currently do give to people to have access to vulnerable young children and to consequently abuse them. And safer recruitment plays a huge part in that. I've already touched on involving communities and local businesses, and that is absolutely essential because there is so much information out there that we don't know as professionals. And it's about asking, how do we give those communities the ability to share that information with the police so it can be acted on? Profiling, tackling the root causes, that may involve an increased police response in identified hotspots, action taken against identified persons who we think might be a risk to children, but as I've said earlier, it may be even more basic than that, than trying to work out what's going on in our communities and in our schools. And to me, a key part is how do we make it easier for people to share information about suspected CSE. The sooner that people can give us information, it doesn't have to be credible, it doesn't have to be absolute evidence, but the sooner we can get that information off them, the sooner the police can start potentially grading it as intelligence and acting on it. The second step to me is actually responding to CSE, and again, I don't think it's something that we've quite tackled yet. A number of areas now work to CSE risk assessment toolkits, Again, it's a huge area, not one that I can probably do justice to in this short time. A number of risk assessment tools are not fit for purpose. Part of the reason that they may not be fit for purpose is an assumption that low risk means no risk, and therefore we treat that child as something that we would regard as suitable for an early help assessment or a common assessment framework response, when actually we've got a key opportunity there to do some really good preventative work and prevent abuse. Often medium risk indicators are indicators of abuse, and if you're working with a CSE tool, please go and check and see if that's the case. And also, does your CSE assessment tool give professionals the ability to exercise their own knowledge of the child, their own professional judgment? Because a number of professionals tell me that their CSE risk assessment tools are too prescriptive, and actually what they come out with at the end does not reflect their professional judgment, their professional opinion. The second point in responding to CSE is recognising the impact of grooming and trauma. I don't think we do that nationally, I have to say. When I go in as an independent author and look at cases where there's been CSE, what I often find is a case may move from high risk to medium risk, or from medium risk to low risk, and everybody relaxing. And actually what nobody's considering is, what is the impact of the trauma that that young person has already experienced? That yes, the risk level may have dropped, but actually our professional response needs to be to then help that young person to recover from the abuse that they've experienced. And I don't see that in a lot of cases. I also don't see a lot of cases where we seem to understand that grooming in itself causes harm, and certainly causes a predisposition to future abuse. We also don't seem to be great at getting peer-on-peer abuse, and what I mean by that is it almost seems to be wrapped up as something that is normal in adolescent relationships. What we're not seeing is great responses for people who are showing predatory sexual behaviour towards other children. And let's be clear, what that does is essentially condemns them to go on and be adult abusers. They are children in need of protection, just the way as the children they have abused are children in need of protection. And it doesn't matter whether you're being abused by a child or an adult, you're still a victim of abuse and you need a response to that. I also don't see great support, therapy for victims and for their families. And those of you who are parents, just reflect on how you would feel if you found out that your child was a victim of child sexual abuse or exploitation. Just imagine what that would do to you and your ability to function on a day-to-day basis and to safeguard your children in the future. It's not something that families can or should be expected to deal with on their own. And what I also see is a depressing number of cases where siblings, where perhaps an older sibling has been involved in CSE, a few months down the line, that younger sibling then becomes exposed to some kind of harm. Also in terms of local authority police responses, I have to say I'm encountering almost a sense of complacency that, well, we've got our policies, we've got our staff trained, therefore what we're doing is fit for purpose. And I think the question is it good enough? Is it preventing CSE? Is it enabling the targeting, prosecution of offenders? Is it actually giving the right responses to those who have already experienced abuse? Across the board, we need to give children who are coming forward, who are giving statements to the police, a better experience in the criminal justice system. I think the current system that we have of children going through hours and hours of police station interviews, of waiting months and in some cases years for a case to come to trial, the appalling experiences that they have at court, and then almost just being dropped and left once the case is concluded. I genuinely don't know how that is allowed to happen in this day and age, and a number of young people that I work with talks about how that trauma was even worse than the abuse itself, and that cannot be right. I also see a number of areas that are just rolling out the same training, or they're getting someone who will come in and do the training for free, and it's stuck at a very introductory or basic level. It's not digging into some of the kind of practice issues that I've talked to you about today. So please don't keep with the same training year after year after year. Think about how you can add value to the skills, the development of those skills in your staff. And I suppose my final word is please keep CSE on the agenda and keep it under review. We haven't cracked it. We haven't got our responses correct. We're a lot better than we were, and I'm not denying that. But we are nowhere near to resolving it as a country. And certainly, in terms of where we are with CSE, we're nowhere near in a position where we can afford to be complacent about it. In terms of keeping updated, I thought it might be just helpful to finish on this slide. The College of Policing have a CSE action plan which is updated regularly. It might be useful for you to look at that. There's also a CSE toolkit for national government which has been released, and more recently the Centre of Expertise on Child Sexual Abuse has been established and has started to produce a number of research papers on a range of issues to do with child sexual abuse and exploitation. Well worth a look. The independent inquiry into child sexual abuse is continuing to hold hearings, seminars, publish research reports. So if you're not already signed up to their newsletter, if you haven't already had a look at their website, I would advocate that you do so. And we've also got a terrific resource at the University of Bedfordshire at the International Centre, and the details are all shown on the slide that you're seeing now. So I hope what I've said has been useful to you, and please do keep in touch. Thank you again for asking me to be part of this event, and keep up the good work. Thank you.